Hello, everyone. Dr. Wilhite here, and welcome to the lecture for Chapter 2. In Chapter 2, we're going to talk about crime. We're going to talk about defining crime, the different classifications of crime, and we're going to talk about the different measures of crime. I'm going to reiterate the fact that not everything you need to know is in my lecture. Don't have time to cover all of that. You do have, after chapter 4, so after the next module, you'll have a test. I would pay particular attention to the questions that the essay questions. Every module has 10 essay questions. I would pay attention to those, and I would pay attention to the vocabulary. Both of those are not only likely, but pretty much guaranteed that that is the stuff you're going to be tested on. I will cover some of the stuff that's going to be on the test in these lectures, but I'm not going to cover it all. Okay, so you do need to read the book and you do need to watch the lectures. So I've already talked about the fact that our laws are really just codifications of our social mores, our social beliefs. And there are certain of our social rules that are made into laws. Now, not all of the most important ones are made into laws because laws are made by politicians. And so some things that should be laws probably aren't, and some things that shouldn't be laws probably are. But by and large, those things that are most important are covered in some way by the critical laws. And the laws really are informed by our society. And so if you think about it, we have federal laws, we have state laws, and we have local laws. And to a large extent, some things are no-brainers. Murder is against the law all over the country. You can't just say, hey, you know what, I want to kill somebody, I'm going to go to Alabama. They'll let me do it there. There are certain things that are illegal all across the country, but there are certain things that may be illegal here that aren't illegal someplace else, right? How many people do you know who have pet ferrets? Not many in California. You know why? Because it's a crime. You can't have a ferret in California. Why? Who knows? I'm sure there's some reason. You can go to Arizona, have a ferret. You can have a ferret in Oregon. You can have a ferret in Nevada. But my God, that ferret turns into a little felon if he comes into California. So laws are different across different states. And so what is acceptable one place may not be acceptable other places. I mean, look at it at a bigger scale. What's acceptable in Europe or Africa or Australia may not be acceptable in the United States. What's acceptable in the South may not be acceptable here. And things change, right? Today, having a tattoo, absolutely normal. Yet 30, 40 years ago, it was considered a sign of deviance. People who had tattoos, you very rightly asked them, how long they did in prison. Whereas we don't associate having a tattoo with being a felon anymore. Times have changed. Homosexuality, right? Homosexual activity was felonious, against the law, could send you to prison in most US states 50 years ago. Okay. Obviously, having a same-sex partner is not going to get you thrown in prison today because laws change based on what society believes is acceptable. And, here in California, we tend to be a little more liberal. Things that are less acceptable in certain places, maybe in the Bible Belt, in Mississippi and Louisiana, and Texas and Alabama, are more acceptable here. Yet there are certain things that we absolutely find unacceptable that other parts of the country, environmental issues of human rights, that they don't really care much about. And so our society really drives what is going to be criminal. But we have to have some way of defining what a crime is, okay? So in most legal definitions, a crime is some intentional or negligent or reckless violation of a law um, that is committed without any excuse, okay? So I will give you an example. In California, California Penal Code 15 says that a law uh, is a criminal offense, something is a crime if there is a law that forbids it or commands it, says you have to do it or you can't do it, um, and to which is given a punishment. So there has to be a law that says you shall or you shall not, and that law must have a punishment. And in California, those in punishments, we've already mentioned, include death, imprisonment, fine, removal from office if you're in public office. Generally, we think that all crimes require some sort of an act and some sort of a guilty state of mind. So again, if you move to the next section up in California Penal Code, you'll see that the California Penal Code says that a crime involves a unity of act and intent, or a criminal state of mind. So our book kind of expands beyond just that kind of basic idea. And it talks about those things that are necessary for something to be a crime. And although all of these may not be listed in the books, reality is that our law, our concept of due process, requires the government to prove all of these before there can be a crime. So the first one is harm. Now, harm can either be individual harm. If I punch you in the nose and you bleed, that is harm. Or it can be harm to our values, right? We say you shouldn't kill people. And if you do, not only have you harmed the person you killed, but you have harmed the fabric of our society. You have harmed what we hold dear, right? The next thing is legality. We have a constitution, and there are certain things that the Constitution says. We have a right to equal protection. We have a right to due process. We have a right to freedom of speech. So our laws must themselves be legal, okay? If we passed a law that said people with blue eyes are not allowed to attend Moreno Valley High School. Well, we could pass that law if we wanted to, but it wouldn't be legal, and it would be unconstitutional, and therefore it wouldn't be a law. Okay. I mentioned that every law requires a unity of act and intent. So that is what is called the actus reus. The actus reus in Latin. It literally translates to the guilty act. The actus reus is the physical part of the crime. You must do something. If I punch you in the nose, punching you in the nose is the actus reus. If I am charged with failing to pay my taxes, the act is not paying my taxes. So every crime requires that you either do an act that the law says you shouldn't do, or you fail to do an act that the law says you should do. Those are called crimes of commission, committing something you shouldn't commit, and crimes of omission, not doing something, not omitting to do something the law says you should do. And the mental part called the mens rea in Latin. And mens rea means guilty mind, okay? Usually in most crimes, that's intent, but it could also be like negligence in child molestation, or excuse me, not child neglect, right? If I leave my 2-year-old alone I say, here's some baby food. I'll be back tomorrow. And the child burns the house down. Okay. Well, I didn't obviously intend for my child to burn the house down and burn up, but I was neglectful, right? And so the law is going to hold me accountable for that guilty mind. Um, the next thing is causation. Um, and causation means that the guilty act and the guilty mind have to come together um, and cause the injury, cause the harm. Um, the next is concurrence. That means that I can have a guilty mind and I can do a guilty act. But until the guilty mind and the guilty act unite to create and cause a harm, there's not a crime. So let me explain that with an example. Say I'm very mad at Joe, whoever Joe is. And so I go home every night thinking about all the different ways that I could kill Joe. And I think about shooting Joe and stabbing Joe and running Joe over with a car. And I think about all this stuff. Now, I can think about shooting Joe all I want. I can think about overturning our government. I can think about doing bad things to the president. For my friends from the CIA or from the Secret Service listening, this is just a joke. Please don't come visit me. I can think about whatever I want, right? I just can't act upon that, right? This isn't a country where if I say I don't like the president, I can be thrown in prison. Now, if I say I don't like the president and try to harm the president, then I can be thrown in prison. This is a country where I can say I don't think the Congress is doing their job. And as long as I talk about Congress not doing their job, I haven't committed a crime. Now, when I try to storm Congress, uh, and that's a crime. So merely having a state of mind that I want something illegal to happen doesn't make a crime. When I act upon it, that is when there could be a crime. But imagine that I'm thinking about killing Joe, to get back to my example. And one day I'm driving home, minding my own business, and Joe is out jogging. And I'm driving along, and for reasons none of us will ever know, Joe, who's wearing his earbuds, jogs right in front of my car. And I slam on the brakes, but there's no way I can stop. And I kill him. And I think to myself, ooh, this is a fortuitous circumstance. I was thinking about killing him, and lo and behold, he runs right in front of my car, and now he's dead. Am I guilty of murdering Joe? And if in fact he ran in front of my car and there's no way I could stop, in other words, it wasn't my fault, I didn't cause the accident, I'm not guilty of killing Joe. Because although I had the mens rea, I wanted him dead. And although I did run him over, there was an act, they did not come together to cause the death. Okay? So the unity of act and intent has got to cause the harm. Finally, every crime must have a punishment. If there is no punishment, it's not a crime. So remember I said the penal code says that a crime or public offense is an act that's committed or omitted in violation of a law that forbids or commands it, and to which is annexed upon conviction a punishment. Okay? That takes in all of the elements of a crime. So all of those elements must be present. One of the things about our criminal law is it's not an either or, right? It's not the best 3 out of 5. It's not an NBA title. It's not the World Series. If all 5 elements of the crime aren't there, there is no crime. Okay. Now, we also divide crimes into categories based on their severity. So the most severe of the crimes is a felony. And under most systems, A felony is punishable by imprisonment in a state prison or a federal prison for over a year. Okay. Misdemeanors are crimes less than felonies. Misdemeanors are usually punishable by a fine or up to a year in prison. Murder, robbery, rape, burglary, grand theft, assault with a deadly weapon, they're all felonies. When I punch you in the nose, when I steal a bicycle worth a couple $100, when I shoplift, those are misdemeanors. And then finally, we have infractions, or what are called in some jurisdictions petty offenses. An infraction is only punishable by a fine. What's an infraction? Running a stop sign, right? Something like that. Now, I said in most jurisdictions because over the last few years in California, in our drive to make our criminal justice system less harsh, we have reduced the sentences for many felonies so that they do not involve spending time in state prison. At one time, it was quite simple in California to figure it out. If they could go to state prison, it was a felony, period. Now, we have many felonies for which you don't go to state prison. Matter of fact, almost all non-violent, non-sexual felonies do not involve being sent to state prison anymore. And so you really have to look at the statute and see how long they can be sent to either county jail or prison. If it's over a year, it's most likely a felony. But most statutes will tell you. Now, the other way we classify the mens rea, right? And the mens rea can either be an intent, the intent to kill, say, or a recklessness or a negligence, say I'm reckless driving. But we categorize crimes into two broad categories. Crimes that are what are called mala in se, and crimes that are mala prohibita. Now, as it goes to the elements of the crime, how much time you spend in jail, mala in se, mala prohibita don't matter. Mala in se and mala prohibita are more intellectual exercises. Crimes mala in se are wrong in and of themselves. Okay? In se, by itself or of itself. Mala, wrong in Latin. Rape, robbery, murder, stealing, almost anything that at one time and still involves a thou shalt not is mala in se. You ask 100 Americans, is it okay to rape people? 100, hopefully, at least 99 are going to say it is wrong. And it's going to be a very firm it is wrong because it is immoral, it is wrong, we don't accept that. Okay? And in most societies, doesn't matter where you go, you just don't do that. Crimes mala prohibita are wrong because we say they're wrong. Why is it that I can buy beer, but a lot of my students who are under 21 can't? Because the law says so. Because we, as a society, our legislature, our politicians have said that's against the law. Why is it that we don't allow gambling, except in limited circumstances, like at casinos, Indian casinos? Because our legislature has said so. Why is prostitution illegal, right? Is it immoral? Well, is it wrong in and of itself? You could argue that. Most of the mala prohibita crimes of morality, right? Law, as I said, against public sex, all the laws that made homosexual sex illegal. A lot of laws, at one time we had blue laws, right? Not only was Chick-fil-A closed on Sunday, everything was closed on Sunday by law. Why? Well, because you should not be out searching for jeans on a Sunday. You should be in church. And so a lot of laws, mala prohibita, are laws because they go along with the Judeo-Christian ideas of the United States. Laws, drug laws, mala prohibita. Okay. So we have a lot of argument over time as to mala prohibita laws. Should drug use be illegal? Should prostitution be illegal? Right? But we don't argue much about should you be able to go rape people? Should you be able to rob and shoot people? Right? So mala in se, wrong in and of itself. Mala prohibita is wrong because we say it's wrong. Okay. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about and really kind of close up with is our crime statistics and how we measure crime in the United States. Now, in the United States, we know that a lot, probably half of the crimes that get committed in the United States are never reported. Okay, either they're not detected, or the people think the police aren't going to be able to do anything about it, or they are reported, but they're not reported correctly. And so those of us who work with crime statistics, those of us who study crime patterns and study criminality, are working with numbers that we know are the best we can get, but aren't necessarily perfect. I mean, if you're dealing with chemistry, we can be exact. Physics, you can be exact. In the social sciences, especially criminal justice, we do our best. We know that there is what we call a dark figure of crime. That amount of crime that occurs that we really don't know about, that we have not properly recorded. And so when we look at crime, we have to recognize that not all crime makes it into the official reports, okay? So generally, we look at crime rates. And crime rates are a measure of the amount of crime that occurs over time. And the importance of crime rates is that they allow us to measure and compare. Say I look at the last 10 years of murders in the city of Riverside, and I compare that to the number of murders in Sun City or Grand Terrace. What you'll find is that there are a lot more murders in Riverside. But does that necessarily mean that Riverside's more dangerous? Well, if all I look at is raw numbers, I can't answer that question. And I can't answer that question because Riverside's a lot bigger than either Grand Terrace or Sun City. And so I have to find a way to compare them. And the way I compare them is by calculating a crime rate. And almost always the crime rate is calculated per 100,000 people, right? And so I will say that although City A had 10 murders in 2019, City A has 1 million people in it, okay? And City B only had 1 murder, but City B only has 100,000 people in it. And when you compare them, you'll find out that their murder rate is about the same. So when calculating crime statistics, we do calculate raw numbers, but what we are really interested in comparing crime is population and comparing it per 100,000 people. If I were to compare burglaries in Moreno Valley in 2020 to burglaries in Moreno Valley in 1960, Well, the first thing I'd have a problem is there was no Moreno Valley in 1960. It wasn't a city thing. But say I could. Well, could I make a real comparison by looking at the raw numbers? And I couldn't, because there were far less people in what is now Moreno Valley in 1960 than there are now, right? There were more cows in Moreno Valley than there were people. There were 100 times more orange trees in Moreno Valley than there were people. So by using crime rates, usually calculated at a population of 100,000, we can compare between cities, we can compare between regions, and we can compare the same cities and regions over time, okay? Now, where do we get our crime statistics? Since the 1940s, the place to go for crime statistics has been the Uniform Crime Report. The Uniform Crime Report is still maintained by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So it's been around a very, very long time. It keeps track of the most serious crimes. It doesn't keep track of all crimes, but it keeps track of murders and aggravated assaults and burglaries and things of that nature. And about every law enforcement agency in the nation reports to the FBI. The uniform crime reports are really valuable when you're looking at differences in time. And they're really valuable in comparing, because the biggest weakness of the Uniform Crime Report is that we know not all crimes are reported to law enforcement. About 50% of crimes that occur are never reported to law enforcement. So the Uniform Crime Report, we know, underreports crime by about half. But the good thing is the Uniform Crime Report has not changed since the 1940s. Minor tweaks here and there, but it hasn't changed. And so the same problems it had in 1960, it has today. So if I want to compare crime reports over time, I can use the UCR to see how much crime has gone up and down. Because it underreported 50% 50 years ago, and it underreports 50% today. If I want to compare Moreno Valley to Riverside, I can use the Uniform Crime Report, because it underreports crimes in Riverside and it underreports crimes in Moreno Valley equally. The other thing Uniform Crime Reports keeps track of is arrests. And so it will keep track of the number of people who are arrested for various offenses. I said it hasn't changed much since it was created in the 30s. And that is another of its huge weaknesses, because literally what that meant in 1930 was the sheriff taking out his little book and going, okay, we had one cow stolen, check. And there was a fight at the saloon, check. And he would send it by telegraph to the FBI. Well, obviously we're using computers today, but the information being collected is exactly the same. And obviously our ability to analyze information and our need for information has gone up tremendously, right? And I think a great example of that is, well over 70% of the student body at Moreno Valley High School is Hispanic. But according to the Uniform Crime Report, you know how many Hispanics have been arrested in the United States? None, ever. Right? Because when I check that I'm white, what's the next question it always asks me? Am I Hispanic? Am I Latino? Because forever, we didn't have Hispanic as a separate ethnicity. According to the Uniform Crime Report, according to the federal government, not only Uniform Crime Report, health statistics, all federal statistics, you were white, you were Asian, you were Black. Those were your choices, right? And so if you want to compare arrest of Hispanic individuals in 1950 to today, you can't. You just can't, because all Hispanics were included with white people. And the other problem with uniform crime reports is the racial information on arrests is based on not necessarily what I think my ethnicity or my race is, but what the police officer said. So if I got arrested and the police officer looks at me and thinks that I am a Pacific Islander, um, according to the federal government, I'm a Pacific Islander. And I think you guys can see that, other than the fact that I vacationed in Hawaii once or twice, I am in no way a Pacific Islander. And so that's the other problem. And, doesn't deal with issues, modern issues, doesn't issue with all of the people who consider themselves biracial, or so there's all sorts of multiracial. So there's all sorts of issues with it. Those are in the process of being addressed, and currently, a lot of agencies that report to the UCR, Uniform Crime Reports, are reporting into a new system called NIBARS, the National Incident-Based Reporting System. NIBARS not only increases the amount of crimes that it allows, but it allows for different races, different ethnicities, allows all sorts of information that UCR didn't. So it's a much better research tool. However, it still underreports crimes, because the only thing that goes into UCR or NIBARS is what the police know about. Most social researchers, most of us who research crime, don't use the UCR. We use it to look at arrests, because those numbers are fairly valid. We look at something called the National Crime Victimization Survey. And the National Crime Victimization Survey is held every 2 years. And it is a survey where people all over the country are called and asked if they have been a victim of a crime in the last 6 months. Okay. And if they are, they're asked all sorts of questions about their being a victim. Generally, we see that the NCVS always shows a higher crime rate than the UCR, because people don't report crimes. Okay. The NCVS does have a downside, because it asks, have you been a victim? Which means if my company's truck gets stolen, and they call me and say, have you been a victim? I'm going to say no, because I'm not a company. If Walmart gets ripped off, if somebody breaks into the Third National Bank, there are no bank robberies in the National Crime Victimization Survey, because they don't call banks, they call people over the age of 12. And so we know that it doesn't report commercial crimes against businesses, but it does a really good job of asking a lot of questions and getting a lot of information about victims of crimes. Okay. If we look at the crime reports, what we find is that over the years, first off, the amount of crime has gone down. So I mentioned this in chapter 1, right? So the number, these are raw numbers. The offenses in millions in the United States was just over 3.5 million in 1973. We come to 2008, and it is below 2 million, and it's slowly going up. This ends in 2014, but we'll find that it does go up. We also find that the gap between crimes reported to the police and crimes reported in the National Crime Victimization Survey and the number of arrests start to get closer together. So more crimes are being reported. By the way, this number, total violent crimes, how did we get that? Statistics. We looked at the National Crime Victimization Survey, we looked at the UCR, we calculated the amount of crimes that people said they were victims of that they didn't report to police, and that's where they come up with these numbers. Either way, we see crime going down precipitously. One of the things, though, that's interesting is we see arrest rates stay relatively the same. Later on, when we talk more about policing, I'll get more into the statistics. Don't want to bore you with them now, okay? The last way that we get information on crimes is self-report. In other words, they ask people, have you committed a crime? And generally, those are parts of larger survey, like the National Institute on Drug Abuse asks questions of the Monitoring the Future survey, the National Household Survey, the National Youth Survey, all survey youths and young people about their drug use, their alcohol use, and their delinquent behavior, including committing crime. Later on, we'll talk about the value of these self-reports. What's interesting is self-reports almost always are higher than the UCR and the National Crime Victimization Survey. In other words, people admit to committing crimes that nobody knew they committed. And what's interesting is if you look at the National Crime Victim, or if you look at the Uniform Crime Report, you will see strong evidence. And I'm going to leave you with this, and I want you to think about it. You're not going to like what I have to say. If you look at the UCR, you see strong evidence that African Americans are responsible for a disproportionate amount of crime, right? They get arrested at almost double the amount of white Americans. So looking at those numbers, it makes perfect sense to conclude that Black people commit more crimes than white people. When you look at self-reports, especially among teenagers, that gap goes to almost zero. In other words, yeah, we're arresting a whole bunch of Black kids for crime. But white kids are committing just as much crime. We're just not arresting them. That's where a lot of research and a lot of recognizing the disparities in our law enforcement and our criminal justice system have come up. And we're going to talk more about that later on in the semester. Just kind of chew on that a little bit. I'll see you later.